All right. Welcome to a public lecture series on the subject of game studies. This lecture series is called Understanding Video Games, like the book that we will be using to introduce you to the field of game studies. I'm Benjamin Hanusek, and before we will start, I'll tell you something about myself. So I've been since about 4 years in video game research, so in the field of game studies, dealing at the beginning with archeo gaming and then going over to game design and video game ethics, which I'm currently focused on. I've been in that time and still am researching, teaching, and developing experiments, publications, games, research projects, all of a bit of all, basically. On the right side, you see the institutions I've been affiliated with until now. And yeah, just to give you a bit background to me, as you will be seeing me now for quite a while if you'll follow this lecture series. So let us take a look at why I decided to talk about understanding video games by Egenfeldt-Nielsen, Smith, and Tosca. So in general, the lecture objectives are to provide an accessible yet academically grounded introduction to the field of game studies, of which I believe not many have been yet out there in form of public resources such as lectures, but even just publications that are freely accessible. However, it was also important for me to nonetheless ground everything on an publication, and therefore I chose the book Understanding Video Game, as it provides the most comprehensive work in introducing people to the field of game studies. At the same time, I'm also using this as an opportunity to provide a resource for my students, but of course, as I'm uploading this on YouTube for any kind of students from any field that would like to know a bit more about the field of game studies. So why understanding video games? It remains, till this very date, from my perspective, the most comprehensive work on the field of game studies, and is widely used as an introduction to the field all over the world in several institutions. I've been talking with many people who teach that subject or who research in that subject. And yeah, understanding video games after over 10 years remains still the essential introduction, as the subtitle even of the book says, to the field of game studies. I think its success is always is also grounded on its accessible language and its very well established examples. So the book can be read by undergraduate students without any problem, including myself. When I started going into game studies, for me it was very pleasant to read, but also the examples that are mentioned are, most of them, if you are into video gaming, you're probably already aware of these examples. And even if not, they are well explained, and these examples are really well selected for cases that are being discussed in the book. Also, what is good is that this book is already in its 4th edition. I don't know if there is already a 5th, to be honest. But yeah, for this lecture series, we will use the 4th edition from 2019, which is a good sign in regards to the relevance of this particular publication. So this book will most likely also receive in the future further revisions, and is therefore perfect go-to point for using a book that will stay that contains subjects and discussions that remain relevant in the near future. What is also great is that the authors, all three, have pretty diverse backgrounds, which allows for holistic perspectives on games. Egenfeldt-Nielsen has a background in psychology. Smith and Tosca are from media and communication studies, if I remember right, and have even their different approaches. This is very much reflected in the overall book and being capable of looking at various perspectives in regards to video game research. Before we will go over to our first section that will be seen in the next video, I'd like to also quickly go over the not the bibliography, the index of the book and its chapters, which are not necessarily mandatory to read in the given sequence. So you could pick out chapters and read them independently from each other. For myself, I learned in a game studies course this kind of sequence, and even looking today at the sequence of chapters, it makes sense to approach game studies from this angle. There might be alternative ways to negotiate the different chapters or provide a different kind of sequence. However, as we're going faithfully through the book, we will start with studying video games as an overall subject. This encompasses approaches to how video games can be studied, who studies them, and which kind of schools of thoughts are still or have been around over the last years. Then go over to the game industry, which I find in particular very interesting, as the game industry remains pretty much hidden behind a wall of non-disclosure agreements. So most of the time we don't really know what's going on in the game industry, because if you happen to work as a developer, most likely you're not allowed to tell too much about how the production process of video games looks in detail. Then go over to what is a game, a quite philosophical question, but also I'd say the most important question you should ask yourself before even starting research, because depending on how you see video games, that will determine which kind of research questions you have and how you will try to solve these questions. Then we'll go over to the history, which is a basic chronological assessment or evaluation of important and established games that have been very influential for the industry, but also the field of game studies. A chapter that I find problematic in regards to providing a very normative, a very common chronology. We all know that disregards for alternative histories, but obviously with whatever kind of history one produces, you always decide to exclude examples. So that this is not a criticism towards the authors, just me pointing out that there are other histories around. Then go over to video game aesthetics, which deals pretty much with the design of experiences and the experience that players have themselves when playing video games, and which components constitute an overall game experience. Then we'll see a cultural studies perspective on video games, so regarding video games as cultural artifact, but also cultural practice, and look at the communities of the video game industry or player communities. And there we will talk about things like representation, for example, in video games. So how do games represent culturally established norms, or how do video games even act as a form of culturally accepted or refused practice in society? Then go over to how video games create narrative, so how narrative is deployed in video games, and how video games themselves are more or less a form of story that they communicate to players. And then talk about serious games and gamification, so how elements of gamification or game design elements have ventured out of conventional gaming and have found new places where they are deployed, such as in normal smartphone apps, but also in the classroom, and games that help, for example, medical practitioners to prepare for a job, military personnel to simulate experiences. So how game design elements are basically used in a non-gaming or conventional gaming environment. And then the last chapter will be video games and risks, which has a very strong psychological perspective. So we look at what kind of effects video games can have, how they can be researched, and which problems research that tries to prove any kind of effects of video games is facing still today. So these are the overall chapter outlines that we will be looking at in the following videos. Each video will be dedicated to one chapter, where I will be presenting segments of the chapter, explaining them, discussing them, and also try to present the final discussion sections in each chapters to also give you a form of, well, something to think on, to ponder on, or even if you want, so kind of homework. So that's it for now. The next video will be about chapter 1, studying video games, and I hope to see you there. Thank you for joining.